Hey folks, how y'all doing today? Jaime of JLd Instinctive Archery. I'm here with the Wingman 115 in my humble abode. And today, guess what? We're going to be building some arrows. So stick around. Hey folks, thanks for coming back and sticking around for some arrow building tips. This is going to kind of be a little bit of a how-to. I'm not going to get too much into the fletching aspect. I will touch upon that, but I'm going to be talking a lot about the painting of my arrow shafts and how I then progress to building the arrows. So there's a little bit of a OCD on my part, and hopefully this will help those folks that are wanting to kind of add a little bit of a customization to their arrows. Now, if y'all have been watching the channel here with Wingman 115, y'all may recall that I did a video on why I favor aluminum arrows. So this is going to really pertain to aluminum arrows due to the way of processing this. It involves some abrasives such as sandpaper and the use of cutlery. And these are items that you tend to not want to use on your carbon or wooden arrows. And again, I went into detail on that on my favoritism of aluminum arrows in that video. So anyways, this is just kind of a very simple and inexpensive method of adding some personal touches. Now, one of the first things that I want to talk about is the fact that this is an aluminum arrow and it is an Easton Legacy. For those that are aware of the Easton Legacy model, they have changed their graphics. So this is an older version. And then to boot, this is the 2020 numerical measurement. If you guys are aware of that or are savvy of that, one of the problems for me is that they don't make this one anymore. Not just the graphic, but that particular measurement. So I have a stash that I bought from Three Rivers that I keep. So I, as all you archers know, when you spend a lot of money on arrows, you kind of don't want to lose them and thrash them. Well, for me even more so, because my arrows are very dialed in, so I have to be careful on not losing track of these or destroying them. So that is the nature of the beast. We all know how that goes. So let's kind of get into this right away. Regarding this raw shaft, it's pretty much ready to go for me. The way I begin my process is I start out by gluing the nocks. Now this is a classic bonding knock. I'm sure old John is going to get a close-up of that. Now this is all what you can consider pretty much old school in regard to the technology and the way that this gets inserted. There are now so many new methods of nocks and whatnot with the carbon shafts, unless you're dealing with this style of aluminum or with the wooden arrows where you still use like a pencil sharpener to get that cone shape. But basically the first thing I do is I glue those into the raw shaft, and I do choose to use the bonding glue, the Fletching glue. And the reason why that is, as opposed to let's say crazy glue, the reason why I like to do that is when we're out on the range and if we miss a target and we hit a solid object, a rock, a stump, sometimes these nocks get popped off, or if you're shooting tight groups, you tend to destroy your nocks. So these end up getting replaced. That's why it's always good to have a big bag of nocks. So the bonding glue is easier for me to crack off, fracture off those broken nocks and replace them. So food for thought, and I'll discuss the why as to, you know, for some of these adhesives. So that's one of the reasons I choose to use the Fletching glue on a knock. It takes about 15-20 minutes for that to cure, or at least allow me to work on it. So once that's on there, I want to make sure that the bare shaft has been wiped down and cleaned down. Some people like to use rubbing alcohol. I'll just use a paper towel, whatever. Just make sure there's no debris. Now, if it is an used arrow, an old arrow, sometimes I'll take some wet or dry mechanic sandpaper and kind of brush off a lot of the old paint. So in my prepared stash here, you can see that that's been the case with this arrow. Now, it's not all been sanded down, but you guys get the gist, where it's been kind of prepped and sanded down. This knock has already been glued in. Now, before I go into the next phase, which is the taping off before the paint, I do want to make sure that this knock is held in place, meaning that the glue has been cured, because you don't want that moving around, and that bonding glue will take a minute. Now that we shift a little bit into the paint phase, for those that know the world of paint, whether it's cars, homes, or whatnot, it's always in the pre-painting, the taping, that most of the work is done. That is because you don't want to mess up and not cover the areas that should be covered, if that makes sense. So it's up to you on how you want to paint your shafts. That's one of the things that gives it that customized look. And for this one, because there is no definitive marker, unlike the newer Easton Legacies, they have a much bolder, more pronounced Legacy logo. It gives you a very good idea of where you would want to put that border. So you guys, I think y'all might understand what I'm referring to if y'all know those newer arrows. In this case, I just had to go with the actual numbers of 2020 where I wanted that to stop. So one of the first things that I do is just regular painter's tape. I am looking at where the number is, and I just start taping around that area. Now I'm going to be kind of quick and sloppy here, but you guys understand, you know, the gist of what's happening here. But obviously this is where your OCD will come in. You know, want to make sure everything's in a good alignment. But you know, I want a nice tight barrier there. And again, if you notice that I've touched the areas that are going to be painted, I do want to clean that off so there's no human oils and whatnot. Regular paper bag. That's all that I used here. Just simply cut it up in about 4x5 pieces. There's no exact science to that. What I like to do, I do leave a little bit of that pre-tape exposed. I hope I'm all in frame here for you guys. And I just simply roll it up. Let's see if I can do this. That's all it is. Y'all can see that. Simple roll. I know the area that I want to get painted off. And then again, with a painter's tape, just throwing it on there. Just a couple of, just a little bit is all you need. So boom, and there you go. Also the knock, for many years, I never really taped off the knock. I figured it was white, but what I ended up realizing was that I was getting the paint that was on here was transferring over to my bowstring and to my finger tap. So guess what? I now do tape that knock off. So again, following your borders and whatnot. And so nothing too complicated about that. Again, I'm kind of just moving quickly for the sake of this video, but you know, let your OCD flourish to make sure that all your boundaries are taped up to how you want them. So that's one of the more important stages, you know, cleaning up the shaft if it's been used, and then taping it off. And now we're ready to paint. Okay guys, so now we're all taped up here and we're getting ready to paint. Now, I'm no paint master or anything, and I've just kind of learned from friends really on to how to properly spray paint. You would think it's just, you know, point and spray, but there is a little bit of an art to it, and also from what I've discovered by messing up. So for starters, I'm just using a regular flat enamel. That's all it is. I just went to Ace Hardware or whatever, and one can will probably do a dozen arrows. So I've already done half a dozen with this, and it's been sitting in the closet, and then boom, here we are again. When we begin the spraying, what I do is I want to add like a primer coat. I'm not using an actual primer. I'm using the actual white paint, but I do a very light, you know, spritz one, and I spray, and then I'll rotate. Spray, and then I'm slowly rotating, and it's almost see-through. I'm not doing a solid coating. You want that first layer to get on there, and then actually I let it sit for 30 minutes. So if I got half a dozen arrows, I'm going to time it from that first arrow that got done 30 minutes. So that light coat just lets it get a good bond on there. Even though this is a fast drying paint, I still give it, again, I give it time, because through experience in trying to rush things, not so good. So 30 minutes off that first primer coat, then I'll come back and I'll hit it and give it a nice, little bit more of a denser solid hold, but not too much where you want a bunch of dripping. And if you notice, I'm doing this little spin rotation. After I'm done doing those first initial sprays, I'll still sit here with the arrow for about a minute or two rotating to avoid any pull up. And that's why, again, you just want to do some light hits. So the initial primer, about 30 minutes, then you know, to let it dry out, and then I have a little arrow rack where I can set my arrows when I know that there's no wet paint that's going to be pooling. After that first initial 30 minutes, come back and then hit it, boom, 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 about, give it 10 to 15 minutes. Now, again, I hit it and I do my little rotational doohickey, let it dry up to the eye, let it sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, watch some Wingman 115 videos, come back, boom, 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 give it a second coat after that initial prime, and maybe a third coat. It all just depends on how it's looking. One of the things that may happen is that you may see a little bit of texture developing depending on the paint. But the things to avoid is getting too close or sitting too much on one side. You notice that I do this rotational thing. That's so that it's kind of getting an even coat. Also, the reason why we put this paper is so that we can start back here with a paper and then go past the end of the knock. So we're getting a nice fluid motion of the paint, if that makes sense. So that's just the way I've done it, because I've realized that is what works best for me. And once it's all painted up, once I've given about 2 to 3 coats after that prime, then I give it at a minimum 12 hours, if not 24. When I've rushed this and I've tried to do it all in one day because it's fast drying, the feathers end up coming off. So it doesn't give time for, on a molecular level, for things to adhere. So that's it. Primer, spinning, 30 minutes. Then come back after about 30 minutes, give it a nice, you know, as you're spinning, hit, let it dry out, spinning, set it aside 10 to 15 minutes, come back, do a second time, maybe a third. And then what you should have after that is a nicely painted arrow shaft. Now here is where I'm a little different from, let's say, your wooden arrows, the people that build those. There are times where, or more than likely on wooden arrows, number one, they're dipping those things. They got to seal them. They got these huge tubes and they're dipping them, and then obviously they'll paint them, but then they crest them. So there's a little apparatus that'll spin your arrow, and you get your fine paint brushes and get the beautiful lines. And I just, you know, I don't have the time, the knowledge, and all that for that. So I'm happy just with this. But I say all that because I know there are some people with spray paint that they can make like molds and whatnot. So after this phase, they're doing different things so that with the utilization of spray paint and not necessarily rotating anything, a gizmo device, they can still add the crest to make it unique to them. So food for thought. I believe I read that in Traditional Bow Hunter magazine on how to do that, but I'm happy just with this aspect. Now, basically what happens after, and this has been sitting for about 12 hours, which is, for me, the minimum amount of time. So we're going to go ahead and do the big reveal and remove the tape. So let's see what we got. So you could already see there's the blue tape. And so that's coming off first. So that's trash. You're going to want to save the wrapping here in just a second. You're going to see what I'm going to do with that. So I'm moving now the initial painter's tape that created the border. Here's where I'm crossing my fingers, making sure I didn't screw anything up, because me and my OCD, I just want to make sure that the numbers of the shaft and whatever it is that I wanted is right at the money, and it looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. So now the knock, if we can find where I last taped that off. And one of the things you want to be careful, obviously, is not nicking those borders, because that could happen. It's never happened to me, but hey, that's why it's good to have like a good tough enamel. Oops. So there's the knock. So it looks pretty good. Now here's, remember this, the pre-wrap? We're going to do the little violin effect. I noticed as I checked on this throughout the evening and into the morning that there's a little bit of texturing, and you may not see it on camera. I know John did some close-ups, but I can feel it. And also that sometimes there's some very abrupt border, so I just do this little violin effect, and all I'm doing is polishing that paint. So just kind of twisting it around. So it's just a very light, aggressive movement, not too hardcore. And this is just helping buff it out. Okay, so now that we're all happy that with our paint job, tape came off, everything looks great, kind of polished off the paint so that it doesn't have any texture on it, so that way we can ensure that the feathers are going to get glued on properly. We're going to get into the fletching aspect. There's plenty of videos out there already on YouTube regarding on the fletching. So I'm going to talk about what I do in my method of fletching, not so much the process of, because like I said, there's plenty of it. But basically, when I started fletching arrows, I was using the BPE, a very inexpensive, very cheap little straight fletching jig, and I wasn't setting them on there straight. I was giving them a slight offset. So I shoot right wing feathers. That's another thing. If you go to purchase a jig and you're shooting right wing feathers, make sure you get a right wing clamp, and vice versa, left wing feathers, left wing clamp. There was one rumor many years ago, going back a few decades ago, that if you were a right-hand shooter, you had to shoot right wing feathers and vice versa. Not true. All you need to do is if you are shooting left wing, make sure they're all left on the same arrow. You can actually shoot an arrow that has all three left and then another arrow with all three right. The uniformity has to be within the arrow and the clamp used, but details, right? So for many years I was shooting the offset clamp straight, but then inevitably as I started getting more serious about bow hunting and I knew I was going to be shooting broadheads that can kind of take over the steering, someone told me that I should start doing helical. What helical implies is that the fletching, the feathers, those that do not know, have a little bit of a spiral, and that's supposed to allow the arrow to have more spin, which is then going to control the arrow in flight with a broadhead as opposed to your field points. Again, this isn't anything new. There's plenty of information. So I decided to invest in the Bitzenberger, the most well-known and respected of fletching tools, with you can see the extreme curvature on that. So right wing for the right wing feathers that I shoot. Again, nothing new here. I fletched these for many years, but inevitably I came across an article that changed my mind, and I ended up going back to straight. And so it's a big topic of conversation. I don't know if I want to get too much into it, and maybe we'll save this for another video in regard to straight versus helical. And when I say straight, I'm not talking about that slight offset. I'm talking about straight. So there's been some great studies done about comparing them to, and why the helical is really not necessary. A little bit of history on that. Apparently, I read this somewhere that Rube Paul was the inventor of the helical that came out back in the 50s. According to what history tells us, is that it was kind of like a new thing to control the arrows, just kind of the latest and the greatest, and that's why it caught on. But if you think about it, throughout history, everyone's been shooting straight and with no problem. But needless to say, I have gone back to the straight, and this makes for a lighter piece of gear in my overall travel kit. So I've kind of come back and gone full circle. So I'll leave it at that, because I could go on rambling regarding the straight and helical. And there's plenty of information on that online, plenty of discussion on forums. So let's get back to the fletching. So once that arrow's painted, and again, this is the part where you got plenty of it on YouTube. It gets placed. Let me do this so you guys see. Obviously, let me go back to the bonding knock. I like that fin, the old school fin. Maybe some of the newer knocks don't have that, but I lined that up. One of the things I failed to mention, I lined up that fin with the diamond of the logo, and that I know will always be where I put my my primary feather of the three, and of the two hen feathers, the cog feather, which we'll get into here. So let me pop that guy in there. So I know that, boom, that's going to be my index feather. That's going to be aligned. So again, there's plenty of YouTube videos regarding all this. And obviously you put your feather into the clamp. Now here's where I'm a little different in regard to the fletching aspect. Instead of using that bonding fletching glue, I just straight up rock and roll with some crazy glue. So Some people like to use double-sided tape. I've never experimented with that, but I'm happy with the Crazy Glue because those feathers are on there pretty good. They're not going to go anywhere. I've had the bonding, maybe sometimes they come off. This takes a little longer for those feathers to cure. Obviously, they cure right away. So when I got half a dozen or more arrows, boom, Crazy Glue. Once the feather's in there, I just do a few dots on there. If the glue is coming out a little thin, maybe I'll do a line, but y'all know Crazy Glue doesn't take much. It's going to be one of those things where you experiment on your own and find out what works best. But a little bit of Crazy Glue on the feather, pop it in there, wait a few seconds. I give it 30 seconds, and then I actually like to remove the arrow, and then you know how you normally spin the dial? The reason why I do that is I realized that my freshly painted arrow shaft was getting scratched up on the jig, even more so on the Bitzenberger. That's that lead cast. So I actually remove the arrow and then spin before I put it back in there to attach the next feather. So food for thought when you're painting them, because I was like, what is this indentation? What is this line? It's coming from the jig. So once all the 3 feathers are on there, get my next prop. I feel like I'm on a cooking show. Boom. So here's the finished product. Now, get this out of the way. I've talked about this in a quick tip video here on the Wingman 115 channel about the bonding glue. So even though I have used the Crazy Glue to attach the feathers to the shaft, once that's done, you know, it's very quick, Crazy Glue dries up, then I come back with the Fletching glue, the bondings, and I'll add a little bead at the very front end of those arrows. And what that does is it creates a little protective barrier. So you see how I'm running my finger? I don't feel anything other than a smooth transition. That's important for me because if I'm shooting through hay bale or out in the woods stump shooting, if there's no protection there, a lot of times that front end of that quill ends up getting ripped off over time. Also, I've noticed on the shelf of the riser on my bow, I got a bare rug rest. That tends to get chewed up pretty good if you don't have a nice little protective transitioning face. So again, this was part of a quick tip that I did. So here I am reiterating that this bonding Fletching glue is a great little way to protect the front end of that quill. So that's kind of about it, guys. I will kind of reiterate the reason why I do like to shoot aluminum because it does go hand in hand with this process. The reason being that I say that is if I have a damaged feather and I need to refletch, just using a simple knife, I can easily scrape off that feather, and then with some simple sandpaper, not too aggressive, just you know, sand it off, smoothen it out, and it makes the refletching a lot easier. One of the also important things I failed to mention is they're easy, having this brightly colored arrow shaft, it's easy to find when it's shot out in the ground. So if we're out stump shooting, Wingman and I, if we're out hitting the 3D targets and we miss those targets and we're looking for our arrows in the duff and all the pine needles, they stand out a little better. Because imagine looking for this in pine needles versus this, so big difference right there. Also, this is super important when it comes to instinctive shooting in the training aspect of it. Every time when we release and that arrow's in flight, we want to be able to see feathers and shafts that kind of stand out to the eye, because in the subconscious mind we're recording those trajectories at those different distances, and that is what enables us to shoot in that instinctive method. It's really subconscious aiming that's happening, and in order to do that through repetition, the mind and body connection is recording the arcs and of those arrows in flight, and that's better done with an arrow that's easier to see. So I think that's it, guys. I really appreciate y'all taking the time to watch this. Hopefully y'all learned something. If you got any questions, throw it in the comments. I'll try to check the questions when I have some time, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you.